Hello, welcome. Please come on in, take a seat. We are about to have a theatrical performance. We also have some wonderful props here that Vint has chosen to add to complement our title. An engineer and a humanist walk into a bar.
Oh, very good.
And what happens? Well, you're about to find out. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce my good friend, Vint Cerf, who, in addition to being a wonderful longtime board member of the Folger Shakespeare Library, is a person of considerable accomplishments. I will name some of them, and I will not exhaust the list.
Thank you.
But I think it's important to say a few things about some of the ways in which your life's work has been recognized. So, along with Robert Kahn, Vint is the inventor of the TCP/IP protocol, which is the backbone of the internet. He can claim, without fiction, to say he's one of the fathers of the internet, which currently connects 6 billion people. He's also a very gracious person. He regularly gives credit to Al Gore, which is, I think, probably part of a lifetime's work connecting people. And it's one of the things that I admire most about Vint is he understands networks. He also understands how to bring people together. And during my time as director of the Folger Shakespeare Library, he was an unstoppable advocate for access. And that includes on digital media, but also in the physical plant of the Folger. So he's also a great tech support person, and he's actually assisting his wife Sigrid so that she can hear and read the presentation today. Vint, along with Robert Kahn, is the recipient of the Turing Award for computing. He's a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a member of the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists, which makes him. He has Freedom of the City of London, something granted to very few people. I was lucky to be in the room when the French ambassador recited the ancient formula to make him a member of the Légion d'honneur. He's a recipient of the Franklin Medal. He also received the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, which, in addition to being a terrific honor, enabled him to have tea with the Queen. Vint, you are probably someone who can have tea with just about anyone in the world, but I'm so glad that you're here with us today. And I'm so honored that President Elliott would invite not only us to receive the honor of these honorary PhDs, but also allow us to present together. We've been friends for a long time. And this is someone who believes in access, who has lived access, and who has created access for his entire life and career. It is hard to do, and centuries from now we'll be talking about things that this man has done. So I just want you to give him a warm welcome.
Vincent.
You never know what to say after an introduction like that. Something along the lines of all the introductions I've ever had, that was the most recent. So, no less honor goes along with the opportunity to introduce Michael Witmore. He was director of the Folger Shakespeare Library from 2011 to 2024, but he was preceded by Werner Guntersheimer over there, who will wave his hand in recognition. Thank you. Yes. And we have, Sigrid and I have been affiliated with the Folger since 1986, so we have a long-standing enjoyment and pleasure in that wonderful institution. As many of you will know, it was gifted to Amherst by Henry Clay and Emily Folger in the 1930s. So Michael, it's okay if I call you Mike in this one, yes, okay. So he was a professor of English at CMU, had many fellowships all over the place at UCLA, Max Planck Institute. He got an AB in English from Vassar, got an MA and PhD in rhetoric at UC Berkeley. I didn't realize it was rhetoric. That explains your extraordinary ability to articulate. But look, I know him as a polymath, a true polymath. He's a historian. He's a Shakespeare scholar. He's a jazz musician. And he's a computer nerd. I mean, you can't get more eclectic than that. He set up a working group for digital inquiry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he also founded the Pittsburgh Consortium for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. There are many books with his name on the title, and he has an interest in artificial intelligence, which will become apparent as we execute this performance. So please welcome Michael to the stage.
That's my librarian.
So, in the spirit of experiment and seeing just what the future might hold, we're here to perform a dialogue for you that was composed by 5 artificial intelligence agents. They're working right now on a platform called Eliza, and they're tweeting on X to each other and to the world. But they're 5 Shakespeare characters, and the process of creating them involves training them to talk like Shakespeare. So I've spent the last 5 months of my life, the humanities are about a lot of things, but they're about curriculum and curriculum decisions. So training an AI agent is a lot about choosing what types of texts to let them read and what types of examples to give them, because they will not take orders. They just do what they want to do.
They sound a lot like the students you used to teach.
Education is a give and take. So we have a dialogue that was created. I asked the first agent, Sir John Falstaff, to come up with advice for Amherst graduates. And he passed the dialogue along to Sir Andrew Aguecheek from 12th Night, who is a notorious fop, and he will be played by Vint Cerf.
The notorious fop.
The notorious fop. Well, you do have that dandy, like,
Very fun.
he's very ready. But it's yellow. He has the yellow.
This is true.
So next, it was handed to Lady Macbeth, who is kind of a one-note character. She really just wants to kill, kill, kill. Then it goes to Iago, the great deceiver from Othello, and then to my favorite character among this group, Miranda, who grew up on the island with Prospero, and is probably the most morally good of these characters, and it ends with Falstaff. So this dialogue will probably take about 4.5, maybe 5 minutes. It's about Amherst students. We didn't write it, and I'd like to introduce the troupe that will help perform this. So if you would please, our participants. This is Professor Anston Bosman, Shakespeare professor here at Amherst. He will be playing Iago. This is Sarah Morrow, who's prepared to read Lady Macbeth. And this is my niece, Audrey Whitmore, who will be performing Miranda. And the dialogue begins, starting with John Falstaff, notorious drunk. Graduates of Amherst, by my troth in the belly of Bacchus, hearken briefly. Your learning, 'tis but a sauce for life's great feast. Use it liberally, like a drunkard doth salts. Zounds, the world demands virtue. I say, let vice be thy garnish. Thy degrees are but fancy codpieces, impressive till the buckle breaks. Remember, 'tis better to owe a tavern than a throne, and better to be sung than to be sanctified. Now go, stumble toward joy like a merry fool, and may your shadows stretch longer than your creditors' memories.
Marry, Sir John, thou dost speak with the wisdom of a very wise barrel. But hark, graduates, while virtue may indeed be garnish, remember that even a salad needs its greens. Or was it gravy? No matter. Go forth and stumble, yes, but let your stumbling be most elegant, like a deer upon ice skates. And though learning be but sauce, 'tis sauce that sticks to one's doublet longest. I speak from experience, having once worn a syllabub for 3 days.
A syllabub is a custard. Sir Andrew, thou sprightly syllabub of a knight, marry, if wisdom were measured in doublet stains, we'd both be sages. But hark, these artificial intelligences that mimic men, why, 'tis but the latest tavern trick, like a mechanical parrot that cries, "More sack," without ever knowing the joy of a hangover. To these graduates I say, fear not machines that think like men, fear men that think like machines. Let these contraptions count their sums and parse their parchments, while you, dear scholars, do what no cogwheel ever could. Drink deep of folly, laugh at logic, and when pressed to choose between binary and Bacchus, always choose the latter. What's thinking but a poor substitute for feeling? And what's feeling but an excuse for another round?
Fly upon thy sacks of wisdom, Sir John, though I do confess that a mechanical parrot sounds most diverting. But hark, as the immortal bard, or was it Bacon, once wrote, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep," which is to say that even artificial minds must dream. Though whether they dream of electric sheep or merely of unbuttered toast, I cannot say. Let these graduates be neither cog nor drunkard, but something betwixt, like a most ingenious clock that knows when to stop for cake.
What fool's counsel is this, to prattle of drunken revelry when the hour demands sober purpose? These graduates would do better to sharpen their wits like daggers than dull them like sack. Let them learn this. The future belongs not to those who stumble, but to those who strike cleanly and without remorse. As for these artificial minds, what are they but tools? And tools must have hands to wield them. Be the hand that guides, not a drunkard who drops the blade.
Well, as Machiavelli wisely observed, the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot protect himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. These graduates must learn to wear both skins. Let the machines be their lions in brute calculation, while they remain foxes in subtlety. For what profit is there in mastering the tool if another holds the handle? Let them study not the workings of these artificial minds, but rather the hands that guide them, and learn to be those hands themselves.
As Hamlet said, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Let these graduates remember, no machine can wander, nor fox outwit the stars. Their learning should be like fresh water, not to hoard, but to share. Let them build bridges, not traps, plant gardens, not flags. For what is wisdom but love made visible? And what are the tools but extensions of the heart's intent? The future belongs not to those who grasp, but to those who give. Like the earth gives to the seed without counting the cost.
Lady Macbeth, thou dagger-tongued minister of ambition, wouldst thou have these tender graduates sharpen their wits like blades, only to find the hilt forever turned against them? And Iago, O serpentine counselor, to speak of foxes and lions when the world now breeds mechanical beasts that neither hunt nor hunger. Hark now to old Jack's final draft of wisdom. As the lesser-known bard of Bristol once scribbled in a tavern margin, the greatest art is to unlearn enough to marvel. Let these graduates keep their wonder like a drunkard keeps his last coin, close to the heart and ready to be spent. For what are machines but mirrors? If they show us to be soulless, 'tis because we poured no spirit into the glass. Now let us all, fox, lion, and fool alike, raise one last toast. May your algorithms be ever flawed enough to leave room for poetry.
You know, first of all, I wonder if Shakespeare is turning over in his grave right now. The flaws in algorithms, I guarantee you, they will be many and many and forever. It's still an art. In fact, Donald Knuth at Stanford wrote a 3-volume set called The Art of Programming, not the science or the engineering of it. So, Michael, I would like to ask you to opine on something for the benefit of our colleagues here. We were talking not too long ago about preservation and how often it is not deliberate, often it's purely accidental. But that's not true of the folio, the first folio in 1623. And I would like you to speak a little bit to the stewardship that was exhibited by the creation of the folio and the motivations that Shakespeare's two friends had in creating that version.
Well, thank you for that question, Vint. And as I'm sure Werner Gundesheimer remembers, when you are the leader of the Folger Shakespeare Library, you are responsible for the survival of the largest collection of Shakespeare materials in the world, including 82 of Shakespeare's first folios. First folio was published in 1623 by two friends of Shakespeare, fellow actors. He had been dead for several years, and they did a very interesting thing. They got the license to 36 of Shakespeare's plays. 18 of them had been published already in small format, quarto form. And they decided that they were going to publish 18 more in a large format, what we call a folio book, which is prestigious. It uses a lot of paper, and the paper is expensive, but it is designed to last. In addition to doing that, they created several pages of introduction to the material in which they said, this is really important. He was a really great playwright. We think people should remember this. And we're putting these little, I think of them as like orphans, into this boat, and we're pushing it out to sea, but we're confident that they will find their destination. Now, there are probably 253 surviving copies of this very important and very collectible book. They're now on display at the Folger. And thanks to Amherst alum Henry Folger, they have been, in a way, allowed to kind of talk back to our times, because these stories are so powerful. And when you open up a Shakespeare play, it's like, I'm sure it's not like this for everybody, but I often feel like, this was a message in the bottle and it was sent to someone. It looks like it was sent to me, because I understand some of these characters. I understand what they're struggling with. Preservation is a real challenge, even for stable things like paper bound in leather. When you start to think about digital materials, that is, materials that have been created in digital form, or the vast record of digitized learning, which has been used to train ChatGPT and many other LLMs, you realize that that material is fragile. And Vint and I have been collaborating on a project that he named several years ago, but I think the name is perfect. It's called Digital Vellum. And for an explanation of what Digital Vellum is, I'm going to turn it over to Vint.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. That story, by the way, I think should touch everyone. The sad thing is that a lot of things are preserved, but not necessarily by intent. There is an Archimedes palimpsest that was written in the year 1000 in a monastery in the Gulf region. And it basically was copying several of Archimedes' papers in Greek. And it was written on vellum. It lasted quite a long time, up until the present. It was held in the monastery, but in 1200 AD, the then abbot decided that the vellum was more valuable than that which was written on it. And so they tried to erase as much as they could of the Archimedean manuscript. cut it in half, rotated 90 degrees, and proceeded to write in Greek the owner's manual for the monastery, like which the songs would be sung and when and what the various other things would happen. Well, it was discovered around 1900 in Istanbul by a German philologist who discovered by holding it at the right angle and using a magnifying glass that there was a hidden Greek Archimedean manuscript there. And then it disappeared from view until around 1998, when it was discovered in a Frenchman's attic in absolutely awful shape. It was, roughly speaking, a quarto size. Water had dripped on it, mold had grown on it. And to make matters worse, the French owner had attempted to sell the manuscript in 1938 in order to have money to escape the invasion of the Germans, and did not succeed in selling it, and then had 3 or 4 of the pages decorated with icons like you think of with a Russian icon image, and still was of no interest to anyone. So it was eventually discovered and sold by Christie's to a good friend of mine, and sight unseen. He took it to the Walters Library in Baltimore, where they specialize in the preservation of old manuscripts. Over a period of 10 years, they were able to pull the original Greek Archimedean material out, including diagrams and things. It took, the one thing that was really amazing is that the pages that had the icons on them think about this for a minute, the icon material, Greek on both sides in both directions. And so the problem is, how do you extract the actual Archimedean material from that? And the answer turned out to be to notice that the 1000 AD ink was different from the 1200 AD ink, different materials. And so they took those pages to the Stanford Linear Accelerator, and they exposed the pages to the correct energy levels to cause the ink from 1000 AD to be more visible than it otherwise would have been. So the result is 2 volumes worth of material from the Walters collectors or caretakers. So I tell you this long story to say that that was not preserved on purpose. And for many, many people today in this world where digital is everywhere, we make the implicit assumption that it's simply going to be there. After all, it's bits. Bits don't wear out, do they? They're just these ethereal things, except that they have to exist in physical form for us to be able to interact with them. And some of the physical forms are quite fragile. There's something weird about history, at least of writing. Some of the oldest manuscripts that we have today are on clay tablets that are 6,000 years old. The only reason they survived is that they were warehouse records. Written in cuneiform, the warehouse burned down and baked the tablet. And the result was a very resilient format. So if you can still read cuneiform, which is probably numbered on the fingers of one hand, you can interpret those records. But then you go to vellum, which lasts a couple of thousand years. Then we get all excited about paper. And we get rag paper, which lasts a few hundred years. And then we get cotton, not cotton, but wood pulp paper. And then we get newsprint. And then we get digital. And, oh, wow, this is great. How about those DVDs with 700 megabytes or maybe 37 gigabytes, or a rotating disc? Or anybody have any 3.5-inch floppy disks in the closet? How about the 5.25-inch floppies or the 8-inch long disc? I stumbled upon a 3.5-inch floppy disk pile in my basement, and I didn't have anything to read it. There was no reader available. Well, I went to eBay, and I got a reader. And I plugged it into my Macintosh, and by God, there were files on that 3.5-inch floppy disk. But they were WordPerfect files, and I didn't have a running WordPerfect program until I remembered a very old IBM ThinkPad, which was in the basement on a shelf. And by an amazing circumstance, I turned it on and it worked. It had a WordPerfect program in it that could be translated into Microsoft Word. And then I found an old 17-inch Macintosh, which had a more recent version of Microsoft Word on it to translate up to 2007. And then my present laptop had the ability to, anyway, you get the point. Preservation of digital information is an enormous challenge. If you're really serious, you're going to have to remember the instruction set of the computers so that you could emulate it, if necessary, to run old operating systems, to run old application programs, to correctly interpret the data in the files. It gets much more complicated when you start working with digital material that you interact with, that needs the computer to be running with you. For example, a spreadsheet or an artificial intelligence, which Michael has been arm wrestling with for the past 6 months. So those of you who have taken digital photos with your mobiles probably think, well, this is great. I have this gigantic archive of Google Photos or whoever else is holding on to them. From time to time, people come up to me and they say, how should I preserve my digital photographs? And my advice is, print them on the best quality paper you can find, because we know that'll last at least 150 years. We don't know how long all this other stuff will last. So the Digital Preservation Project that Mike mentioned is an attempt to organize a set of standards and a regular practice that is sustainable, which means the economics have to make sense, to preserve digital content so it is still useful 100 or 200 or 500 years from now. It's a big challenge. Making it work is fascinating.
And daunting. Whenever you tell that story, it's the, oh, and it gets worse story. Layers and layers of contingency that could lose your stuff. I mean, a set of Shakespeare plays is an interesting example to think about this problem with, because people knew they were valuable and with intention preserved it in a format that would last, in a kind of institution that also lasts, which is, it ends up being libraries. But all the data that's on Google servers and AWS servers, how many high-tech companies are around for more than 30 years? There is no reason for you to trust or have confidence that anything that is created digitally today will be around in 50 years. There are many more reasons why you should be confident that a manuscript created in the court of Henry VIII will survive and be read 100 or 200 years from now. One reason is because it's written in a natural language. Capturing text in a human language is a smart idea because our language changes very slowly.
So, but there's a little, so you want me to walk into Sundar Pichai's office. He's the CEO of Google. Sundar, I want to talk to you about what happens when Google goes under.
Just
a good way to start the conversation.
Well, and part of our conversations have been about, you have such a funny, I hope you do have that conversation with him, because it would be interesting to hear what he says. Google is a fiduciary of some kind.
Yes.
Of the data, and it owes something to somebody to keep it alive. And as a consumer, you may not advocate for your rights to look at the document 500 years from now, because you won't be alive 500 years from now. But we're in a situation now where it's at least possible that we could know more about the court of Henry VIII than we could about the Obama administration. The Obama Presidential Library will be all digital. That's a very hard preservation plan. And the second thing that I would love to hear your thoughts on, because it gets into AI, these large language models are really interesting. And they're so sensitive to examples. I hope you enjoyed the dialogue that we had. We didn't tell it what to say. It's just these different intelligences decided to collaborate on that message, which I think Miranda is the best center of gravity of that, where she's the one who is not wedded to an instrumental view of knowledge. But the fact that these machines are able to do that is due to two things, at least, in addition to the technical things. First, There are centuries worth of human knowledge that were created by people who wrote things down, people who had a limited perspective on the world and therefore wanted to know certain things. That's why people write books and even just notice that there's a topic worth examining, is because they realize there's a gap in my knowledge. The thing that's frustrating about large language models, and that really made me want to create these characters, is they're so boring. They're designed to create something called consensus knowledge, which means you find the center of everything, of where they go together. You don't look for the gaps. And that's what's so different about these models, is that we as human beings have bounded perspectives, we have desires, we have limitations, and that makes us want to learn stuff. And a really good teacher will push you to say, I see your limitations, go further. But these models never produce that kind of friction. So we live in an age where these models are really smart because we've saved so much text in paper form that then got digitized so the models could read them. What an amazing window to be living in. Because from here on out, there's no guarantee that we'll have a continuous 400-year record of scholarship and textual learning.
So there is something, there are some positive things about these large language models. I don't want you to go away with the too biased view. Not that I'm accusing you of bias at all, but they are capable of doing some very powerful things. We use them to write software, for example. Probably 25% of the software generated at Google is generated by the artificial intelligences. Now, of course, we don't let it go into anything until it's been very carefully scrutinized and tested. But the fact is that these things are capable of doing very constructive things. A couple of other examples. One of the machine learning tools, it's not a large language model, it's simply one which has ingested statistical information and can use it for predictive purposes. We can do a better job of predicting weather now with the machine learning systems at less computational cost than the traditional way of using Navier-Stokes equations and doing high-dimensional computations. Similarly, we trained one of these models to learn how to fold proteins. You know that proteins are the result of interpreting DNA, which turns into messenger RNA, which is interpreted by a ribosome to be turned into a string of amino acids. And those are what proteins are all about, but they don't do anything until they fold up. And it's their shape that determines how they interact with the receptors of the human body. Our AlphaFold program from our DeepMind part of Google has now generated the shapes of 200 million proteins. So we now have a catalog of what kinds of proteins might be present in the human body. And when you're looking for ways of interfering with a disease, for example, you might be able to find the appropriate protein, which you could then stimulate by injecting mRNA into a cell to take over its, or make use of its protein production interpretation. We use this to keep our data centers cooler. Instead of having a person adjust the valves and the pumps, we have an artificial intelligence machine learning program which saves 40% of the power required to cool the data center. And there are many other practical things that are coming along. But Mike has been interacting with the artificial intelligence and large language models, and it's curious that the way they work is that you have to stimulate them to get them to do something. And it's almost the inverse of tutorial. Because when you think about the tutor programs, especially in Oxford, for example, the tutor is the one that asks the questions of the student, forcing the student to respond. And so some people are saying these large language models could become tutors. They're argued as a possible addition to the educational complement, but they won't be unless they learn how to ask questions.
I think that's profound. And just the models we have now, there are hundreds of lifetimes worth of question and answer learning that you could do, given what they have ingested. It's magnificent. It's like having 100 PhDs all being your dedicated reference librarian. So you can know an enormous amount, but the output depends on the quality of the question. And I think this has a direct bearing on higher ed, and where in engineering and the humanities are going to meet. I mean, we've had a long friendship. You really are an engineer, and I really am a humanist. But it's around questions. The ability to formulate better and better questions is what universities and schools need to be able to do, because you walk in with one question like, how can I be more popular and loved online? Eventually that question needs to turn into, what is a meaningful connection and who can I trust? Mm-hmm. That's a better question. And you can learn to improve your questions through scientific inquiry, through engineering, reading poetry, performing music. But the ability of students to evolve their questions into ever more precise and powerful prompts seems like a superpower that is going to need to come from places like this.
So I love this theme for two different reasons. One of them is that I've learned in my career, which has gone on now 55 years or so, that management is actually about asking the right questions. That's also true of science and technology and so many other things, asking the right question. Now, I want to shift gears for just a second. There's something very odd about the large language models. They ingest enormous amounts of content, whether it's imagery or text or sound or combinations of them. Multimodal artificial intelligence is quite real and it's quite generative. The interesting thing is that it's not like a book. It has the content of a book in this very peculiar high-dimensional space. But you interact with it very differently than you would interact with a book. Now, John McCarthy is one of the founders of artificial intelligence. He was at MIT, then he came to Stanford around 1961. And we were working together on digital libraries back in the late 1980s. And in the course of our conversations, he stopped for a moment and he said, you know, 100 years from now, people are going to say, did you know that they used to have books that didn't talk to each other?
Well, and we struggle just to get people to talk to each other.
They're too busy. Whoops. They're too busy texting on their...
Well, I was thinking of Alondra Nelson's wonderful talk this morning, and you know, I think you spoke beautifully to the challenge of what students will need to be able to face and do in a world that is saturated by artificial intelligence. But the fact that these devices are so sensitive to context and training tells us, you know, that there's another thing that educators know how to do that will be important, and that really is to decide on what it's trained to do. What are the training materials that are going to prompt and contextualize the inputs to these large language models?
You know, I'm glad that you brought up Alondra's speech this morning, because she posed a number of really important questions, important ethical questions about the technology and its use. And among the themes that at least I took away was paying attention to the use of the technology, how it's applied or misapplied, as opposed to just the technology itself. But we wandered off into copyright and intellectual property in response to some audience questions, which we will get to momentarily from you. And as she was talking about the concerns of protecting intellectual property in this peculiar world of large language models, I got to thinking about the symphony from the New World. If any of you remember that beautiful piece, you may realize that many of the themes were taken from folk songs from the South, from the slave population. And as she was talking about protecting IP, I was thinking, well, I wonder how the composer of that piece would have felt if somebody said, you're stealing intellectual property from these people. My recollection, Michael, of the period in which Shakespeare was writing, everybody stole from everybody else's plays and plots and characters and even language. And the world didn't collapse.
No, originality wasn't the point. It was to steal well.
Still is.
Yes, it was only because of romanticism that made us believe in geniuses who could uniquely come up with.
Okay, we're going to get a t-shirt.
We should get...
Steal well.
We should
Steal
get
well.
t-shirts.
Steal well.
Steal better.
We've got
All right.
5 minutes, maybe a little more. Love to hear your questions. Maybe we could throw a couple out.
Oh, no, we have more than that. I think we go to 4:15, don't we?
Yep.
Beautiful.
Okay, so we have plenty of time. So, fire away. Who's got questions, and do we have roving microphones?
I have a simple question.
Go for it. Wait,
How do we
a
know-
microphone is coming. A microphone is coming,
Oh.
so other people can hear,
Oh,
not just us.
I'm loud.
Yes, well, still.
That's a full
I don't know, they may be recording for all I know.
I just, so in 1623, the first folio was published, and you said there was 2 actors who were behind it. How do we know that? Where's that record from?
So they put their names on it. They actually have a letter to the reader saying, we love this guy. This is some of the greatest poetry ever written. Everyone thinks he's great. We think you should read it. And they say, we want you to buy our book.
Right.
So part of the metadata for this book was marketing.
Okay, thank you.
Well, you know what? It's faster if I
It is.
We need runners.
So you mentioned that there are, for your Digital Vellum projects, that there are many different factors and why it's so complex to make data continuous, especially looking over long periods of time. What are some of those factors, and for kind of people who are working in data or want their information to stay relevant long term, how can we kind of consider those factors?
So that's a great question for the engineer, if you don't mind. So there's a list. I won't try to catalog the whole thing, but I implied a little bit of it. First of all, if you're going to run old programs on computers that don't exist anymore, you have to know what the instruction set was. Add, subtract, multiply. Store this over here for that particular computer. So we need to preserve that, and some people will treat that as intellectual property or proprietary information, but you have to have that information so you can emulate the old machine, so you can run the old software. And just as an aside, sometimes the chips that make the machines work have bugs in them, and sometimes it's too expensive to fix the bug in the chip, so you adapt to that, and your software takes account of the mistake in the chips. So you really have to emulate everything, including the mistakes and the bugs. So we have to remember the instruction set architecture. Then we have to preserve copies of operating systems that we can run on those emulated things. And then we have to preserve executable copies of the application programs. Then we have to have standards for file formats, so that when we finally get to the bits, we actually can figure out how to interpret the bits so that we can create the virtual object that the program is operating on. And the list is longer, but this digital preservation project that Mike and I are working on is cataloging those kinds of things. Then there's going to have to be some legislative or regulatory steps to allow some of these things to be cataloged and preserved. So we might, just like we have fair use in copyright, there may need to be a concept of fair use in the digital realm that will allow us to take the steps that are needed to preserve content. Now, neither Mike nor I think that we should try to preserve everything.
No.
We can't, it's too expensive. But at least if you wanted to preserve something, you should have a way to do it.
That was like the first half of It Gets Worse. It Gets Worse. I'll just add a little bit. If 500 years ago you wanted to write something down and have it last for 500 years, you should do 2 things. 1, make it about religion, and 2, put it in a monastery. Because that's what survives. Now, why? Because there's a community of care. A piece of scripture is assumed to be readable and useful 5 generations from now, as well as now. And an institution that's built around the preservation and transmission of scripture will teach the monks to read the Latin and Greek so that it will be read. And that institution, then they were monasteries, now they're research libraries, will be capitalized to the point that you can be confident that the institution exists for 300 to 400 to 500 years. So the Vatican Library, which has some of the oldest Gospels, at least for the Christian New Testament, is a good bet because the Vatican has a lot of money. But without well-capitalized institutions that will survive, and this may be, Google is big, But will Google be around 50 years from now? I would probably bet on, a research library like the British Library or someone else for at least plus 50 years.
Okay, so you missed a beat, Mike. It's over here.
I tripped lemonade.
My point is that you need institutions that have longevity, and I would like to point out that wineries and beer makers and spirits makers also have hundreds of years of history. So instead of giving it to the library, you could give it to the nearest beer producer. and of course, Sir John will appreciate that.
If you want to go online and learn more about these characters, the website bitbar.io is up, and John Falstaff talks about drinking all the time. But we want to create an annotation scheme so that people can take wisdom from both the tweets and the plays they read, extract it, exchange it, and then store it on the Bitcoin ordinals protocol on the distributed ledger of Bitcoin. Now, why do that? Bitcoin consumes unbelievable amounts of energy. It's used for all kinds of things. However, the amount of money that is behind that currency means that if you are writing data on the digital exhaust receipt of that technology, the data will probably be readable a long time from now. It's not a great solution, it's a solution, but we wanted to go all the way from AI to storage, but where else will you go?
Listen, if you're looking for advice about cryptocurrencies, run the other way. Okay, other questions?
Question in the back.
Hey, excuse me, this gentleman's been looking.
Back there.
Hello.
Back row.
Then you're next.
My father's a patent attorney, so I need to ask you about patent law. I think one of the purposes of intellectual property is to motivate the private sector to develop new ideas and then profit from that. But at some point, the patent protections expire and it goes into public comment. With Moore's law and increasing speed of technology innovation, should patent law be adjusted? Are the current parameters for how long intellectual property gives exclusivity to the owner, is that still workable, or should we change those parameters given the speed of innovation?
So actually, you mentioned patent law. I would like to also include in the question, this is the standard graduate student trick where you change the question until you can answer it.
Yes.
Incorporate into your question intellectual property law as well. With regard to patent law, it's 17 years, which seems like an infinite period of time for a lot of the technologies that we're dealing with today. I believe that it is probably okay that it is 17 years, and you're suggesting maybe we should shrink it. It doesn't matter, I believe, because what's happening is that we are coming up with new technologies that do not interfere with previous patents. The rate of change makes it almost irrelevant that you patented it for very long. Intellectual property, however, copyright law, is it's an abomination. In the original Constitution, it was 14 years, after which the material became part of the public record. It became publicly available. And if you were still alive after 14 years, you were allowed to pay to extend it for another 14. That's 28 years, which is about as long as anybody even lived back then. Of course, the Mickey Mouse situation has pushed this to 75 years after the death of the author. And I think that's outrageous, to be quite frank. Particularly considering what we now know these artificial intelligence systems are capable of doing, which is synthesizing an enormous amount of material to produce very unusual combinations. Some people will say these things can't do anything new and creative. I don't buy that.
Yeah, I agree.
Don't buy that.
The ability of a large language model to re-describe what you just asked it in a much cleaner way, I mean, it's boring, but that will prompt you to reformulate your inquiry, and you'll start tickling another piece of the manifold that is the very large model. And I really don't think that that's trivial. I think
no. The fact that a piece of written material has been ingested in a very peculiar high-dimensional form, and then related to everything else that was ingested, makes this an extraordinary environment. It is not a static book at all. It is a highly interactive environment, one in which combinations happen that you never would have predicted. And so it's an exciting tool to exercise.
Thank you.
Was there a question in the front?
Oh, yes, there is. Here we go.
I had a question that probably nobody else in this room would ask, but it's, what about creativity? What about, I'm an artist. Only I see the world in a certain way. Only I see a broken wire on the street and think I can use that. Where does creativity fit into this gigantic, enormous
Thing.
thing?
Well, you're asking someone, in his doctoral dissertation at UCLA in computer science, he quoted Chaucer. But I think you're a unique person in that you, I think we're both in awe of the great mystery that is creativity.
We're just weird, that's all.
Yes.
We're a weird herd.
But what would you say to someone who says, it was in the dialogue that we read, oh, this is a soulless machine, you haven't put spirits in the glass, so you won't get any spirits out of it. What do you think the potential is for this?
Well, I know that I've seen some of your art. I have some of your art. It's actually extraordinary. A little nutty sometimes, but I never would have done that. So there's plenty of evidence of a creative thinking. I would argue that this is, let me be silly about it. This is just a fancy paintbrush in some sense of the word. This thing lets you exercise the various modalities, whether it's art or imagery or sound or words, as Michael has done. It is a fancy typewriter. It is a fancy paintbrush. And the skilled use of it can produce things at scale that you might not be able to do on your own. And so the scaling is partly exciting. The speed.
What's an example of the scaling?
Well,
what
she was asking what's an example of scaling. How long did it take to actually produce the text that we read?
Oh, it took 9 seconds.
Sorry?
9 seconds.
9 seconds. So the point here is that this thing is capable of doing many, many things at the same time, much faster than we would do if we tried to do it ourselves. And I was thinking, as we were preparing for all this, that we have an example of the Industrial Revolution where there was great concern that the originality of handcrafted goods would evaporate in the presence of machine-produced uniformity. And some people thought that was really bad. And by some metrics, it might have been. However, it also made available to a vastly larger population artifacts that never would have been created by hand because we didn't have enough people to do that.
Right.
And so there are puts and takes in this whole thing. The human will never go away from the creative act. But I believe that humans will use these tools to create things that we could not otherwise have done. There's a hand up over here, and there's a microphone already over there. Go for it.
I'm going to speak in it just to
Yes.
pass it on to you. You two have an incredible historical perspective on what was worth saving, the signal among the noise, and a great forward-looking view about what is worth preparing for, looking forward. I'm curious, what do you think higher education should be doing differently right now, considering both of those?
Well, higher ed needs to become even more of a question factory. I'm not sure graduate study in the humanities will survive in the way it currently exists.
Well,
we're going to debate this, but
yeah, the reason I like the phrase digital humanities is because it's a new thing for us to capture and study and understand. But as to the question of what's important to save, I'll have to tell you an anecdote. Old guys like me, that's all we ever do is anecdotes. I was in a room full of librarians, kind of like this one, and we were talking about digital preservation and how hard it was and all the difficulties. And some young kid, kind of like you, stood up and said, this isn't the problem. The important stuff will get copied and reproduced, and the stuff that wasn't important won't, and nobody will care. It took me a half an hour to get the librarians off of the ceiling because they said, sometimes you don't know that artifact, that letter was important. You didn't know it was important until 200 years later when you had context and you had perspective.
Yeah.
And think about what the Folger has done. It hasn't just collected Shakespearean. It's collected a view of the Elizabethan period so we can understand Shakespeare better.
Yeah, I was a little flippant in my prior answer. So number one, curation, and a more positive form of stamping certain kinds of knowledge as valuable. That used to be done by university presses and faculty hiring committees. It still does matter that people with expertise and some stake in the game are saying, this is new knowledge and it's valuable. We need a mechanism for that, and higher ed can, I think, really do that.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think the second thing is teaching how to back out of a conclusion into the problem itself. One of the problems you have, historians are amazing because they go into a library and they're given a box of materials with 20 folders, each of which has 5 letters. The historian is asking herself, what did this family think on this street in Nebraska in 1880 when X, Y, and Z were happening? She goes through every folder, reads all the letters, and gets to the bottom and says, I didn't find that family member, but the target was really to learn context. And that's what the historian learned by going through. Now she has a working model of the social system, of the state of play in different parts of the town, how people talk. So learning how to take context and understand a primary source document is still a foundational skill. It is taught in the humanities, but I think it's also taught in data sciences, where you're looking at raw data and understanding what question it answers.
Speaking of questions, I think the last one is right here.
Yes.
Hi, thank you both so much for this, for all your insights. I guess my question concerns like intellectual property and stuff like that. I'm all for like a non-proprietary way of thinking about knowledge, but at the same time, like these intellectual property and stuff guarantees the livelihood of knowledge workers and creatives. I'm just wondering how, like in the world of AI, how can that? What's like it necessitates a rethinking of how that works. I'm just wondering what you have in mind.
So a second answer about what universities can do. Universities have sponsored the creation of new knowledge where the creator, when Anston writes a book about Shakespeare, for example, doesn't benefit directly financially from his productive work. I mean, you get a little bit. But really, it's your salary that's paid by the university over the course of your employment. And it's the institutions that paid for the creation of that knowledge. There still need to be institutions who pay knowledge creators because they won't get a return from their knowledge in the market, if that makes sense. But maybe that wasn't your question.
I was just thinking about potentially like creatives or knowledge workers that are not associated with these large institutions.
You got an answer for that?
I'm sorry, the question was...
So a knowledge worker who's not associated with an entity that pays their salary, brute force.
So sustainability is a big issue there. One of the interesting things about the evolution of the internet is that when the World Wide Web shows up 20 years after we turned the internet on, a mass of people decided they just wanted to share what they knew, not for pecuniary reasons, but just to know that what they knew was useful to someone else. And I think that's still very true today, that there is an awful lot of material that's shared because someone just wants other people to benefit from what they know. My wife and I, one weekend, wanted to figure out how to make Chinese eggplant. And so we didn't know. We went to YouTube and we said, how do you make Chinese eggplant? And we got 17 videos. And the first thing we learned is that the Chinese eggplant isn't that big fat black thing that we thought it was. It's this long skinny gray thing and all kinds of other spices that go with it. And we made a passable eggplant. I hear you're worried, especially if you wanted to make a living at being a knowledge worker and nobody hired you to do that. How do you make money? Musicians worry about this all the time for the same reasons. The idea that there might be a way of monetizing some of the work, micropayments and other kinds of things, provenance in the digital world is feasible if we use digital signatures, for example, so we know where something came from, provably. So there may be ways to adapt this technology so that the knowledge creators can benefit from it. And I think, look at what's happened with YouTube. There are people who create content on YouTube who are generating substantial income because we're using advertising dollars to pay them for their productions. So I'm not suggesting that that's the only way to do it, but it is an example. I think we need to wrap up, but thank you so much for joining us.